Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to, I think, the sixth session of the Nāgārjuna Mula Madhyamaka Karika reading group. And we're reading chapters 8 and 9. An analysis of an object and its agent, and an analysis of what is prior, which is an analysis also of the appropriator in a process by which an agent appropriates the skandhas as its own. So yeah, I guess we can start off with the topic that the commentary here starts off with, which is like trying to explain how some of the wording that's being used and the meaning that's implied by them is based on certain conventions within Sanskrit grammar. I know Sagar, you read and study in Sanskrit, and maybe Aditya, do you guys have any comment on this, on what's being said here?
I would just comment that this distinction isn't peculiar to Sanskrit. It's the manner of marking the agent in a particular way in any given sentence and marking the object in a particular way in any given sentence with case endings is peculiar to Indo-European languages, but verbs, all languages have verbs, and verbs by nature are done by some object and done to some object. Well, with the exception of certain verbs, which aren't actually treated as though they're done to some object. Like, for example, when you run, you don't run, I guess you run towards something, but you don't do running to something the way that you, say, cut something. But in any case, this isn't like a distinction peculiar to Sanskrit. Verbs in every language, for many of the verbs, just because of the nature of certain actions as we as humans in our minds understand those actions, actions like cutting or opening or throwing, involve something, some object that does the action and some object to which the action is done. So the language of it, or the terminology, as they say in the introduction to it, this terminology derives from the grammatical cases of Sanskrit, but the actual categories, I think, are not just present within a certain group of languages.
Cool. Yeah, it seems like, it just applies to as much as it to English as it would to Sanskrit. At the same time, I think the fact that they brought this up is interesting because it repeats a similar point earlier on in the book, where a lot of these analyses are not necessarily just based on analysis of causation, like causal relationships, but also grammatical relationships. And so relationships on the level of explicability, what we can say about what things are happening. So yeah, so the commentary sort of tells us not to have too much of a restricted idea of what an object or an agent is, because in the example they give with a rock falling on the ground, in this case, the rock would be the agent who performs the action of falling, of hitting the ground, which is the object. Well, so yeah, so here the object or karman is defined as the goal of the agent or the karaka. And likewise, the agent is anything that engages in activity aimed at some goal. So that's just a basic definition to give here. And what the commentary also sort of lays out in anticipation of the verses is that we can situate the relationship between the object and the agent in terms of their ontological status as either being real or unreal. And we can exhaust 9 different possible combinations of this relationship. And what Nāgārjuna will proceed to do is basically go through and analyze each of these different combinations of object and agent in terms of the ontological status, and would seek to refute the idea that, I guess, that they exist inherently in any way. So I guess we can slowly go into the the verses. I don't think we're going through all the verses one by one, because that would be a lot, but I think we can sort of go in chunks and go over the general arguments that's being made. So verse 1 is basically stated as the conclusion of an analysis that happens from verses 2 to 6, and that's analyzing the relationship in which an agent and an object have the same ontological status of either being real or unreal. So the verse says, a real agent does not bring about a real object, nor does an unreal agent aim at an unreal object. So the following verse, verse 2, there is no activity, kriya, with respect to an agent that is real, so the object would be without an agent. There is no activity with respect to an object that is real, so too the agent would be without an object. So here now we're being introduced the concept of action, or kriya. And so kriya, I guess we can say, is what mediates the relationship between an object and an agent. It's that by virtue of which the agent comes to be known as an agent. And it's also that which consists of the production of that object. So that's how sort of object and agent relate to each other, through action. So in verse 2, so there's two arguments here. So I'll repeat that. So the first argument is there is no activity with respect to an agent that is real, so the object would be without an agent. So by following the commentary, I think, given by Chandakirti, what I've sort of gathered from this is that a real agent must have already acquired its object by means of an action that qualifies it as an agent. So to say that agent is real, it must have already completed, fulfilled this function as an agent. But then this requires that we need an additional activity that qualifies the real object that's the product of that action. Otherwise, the object would exist without the agent which produces it. So on the one hand, we have, for a real agent, we have the activity that qualifies the real agent as an agent. But then we also need an activity that qualifies the real object as having been produced by that agent. And it doesn't make sense to say that there's two activities. A relationship of production only happens once, right? You don't produce twice for the same thing.
I can't think of a response to this argument, but it has the feel of a trick. Do you know what I'm saying? I actually don't know what the response is, or what. I guess, why can't there be a single activity that makes it so that both the agent and the object are what they are? Why?
Well, if it's a causal series, then that activity must have been, I feel like the activity.
Why can't the agent and the object be what they are at the same time then?
So I thought this too, and I thought there was some trick involved too. So I think I had the same intuition as Sagar. But I think what this really reduces to is a 3 times argument once again.
Do you think so? But
I do. I think it's the same argument.
I mean, it reintroduces the concept of the action, right? So isn't that also comes up with the analysis of the mover?
Because an object doesn't exist as the object of a verb until the verb is done to it, which means that the agent, but if the agent is going to be the agent of a verb. Wait, yeah, so I don't understand. Why can't a thing exist and not be the agent of a verb, and then become the agent of a verb that is being applied to something at the very same time that that thing becomes the object of that verb, right? Let's say we have knife, it's not currently a cutter because it's not cutting. And we have carrot, it's not currently a thing that is cut because it's not cutting. And then at the very same time, when cutting occurs, the knife changes into the state of being a knife that is a cutter, right? Like that the knife as a non-cutter stops existing, and a knife that is a cutter comes into existence and is real at the very same time as a carrot that is cut comes into existence, it is real. Well,
Well, that sounds like you're multiplying the mediating moments. So on the first hand, there's the cutting, and then there's the cutted, but there's only that cutting, right? So it's the act. So this is the same problem where you're duplicating action. There's an action that qualifies the cutter as a cutter, and then the action that qualifies the cutting, which is the object being cut. But really, there's just one action of cutting.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. There's one action of cutting, and it, as one action, simultaneously makes the knife both a cutter and the carrot a thing that is cut.
Well,
I think that is an acceptable conclusion to a Madhyamaka, though, and they would just say that, look, this shows that neither of these entities are intrinsically real and they're mutually dependent. And I think what he's trying to show is that, you know, the cutter is what makes the cutting, and the cutting is what makes the cutter. And you know,
so to call one of them the,
otherwise it would need to be qualified, like a cutter would need to be qualified with being able to cut prior to it cutting. But if it occurs at the same time, this is to say that they're not, like, neither of these entities are intrinsically real.
Right.
So I think yeah.
3 times argument, with the 3 times argument, the problem with the cause and effect existing simultaneously is that there's no way then to say which is really the cause and which is really the effect if they occur simultaneously. Exactly. So are you saying that the same thing is true with agent and object, that if the action in a single moment renders one thing the agent and one thing the object as part of what relates to the verb in a single instant of time, then there's no way to say which is really the agent and which is really the object in that situation?
At least there is a way to say it, but this would only be conventionally designated. Like, right. This is how I took the argument, at least.
So the thing that, like,
and if you wanted to, oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, I think we were about to say the same thing. I was about to say the thing that's a test for this, like with the causality thing, when you say cause and effect occur simultaneously, is that you could just as easily arbitrarily create a story wherein the opposite is true, and the thing which you're conventionally calling the cause is the effect, and the thing which you're conventionally causing the effect is the cause. And I guess that's kind of true for this too, where you could just say, rather than cutting being what's occurring here, we're going to invent a new verb, which we'll call tucking, because that's just cut spelled backwards. And tucking is the verb that here the carrot is doing to the knife. And clearly, if it's one activity occurring in a single instant between these two objects, that in single activity could be framed as coming out of the powers of the carrot just as much as it's out of the powers of the knife, as long as you just, like, call it a different activity, tucking instead of cutting.
Yeah, or like the negation would be switching from the active to the passive voice or something. But I think your point is right. Or you could just make a fictional verb and have that be the negation. But yeah, I think this is the point that's being made.
Right. But if you did make a fictional verb, that convention probably would not actually be built by us convention building minds, because that would be a bit of a useless verb, perhaps. That is, it doesn't seem to mesh well with our others group of conventions. Like, for example, that carrots are things for eating and smaller pieces for eating are easier to eat, and like there's just such a big web of conventions that I feel tucking would not fit as well into them as cutting.
But hold on, tucking could be super useful for attaining nirvana, because like now I understand this concept way better. Depends on what our aim is, right?
That's true.
Well, I think something I want to point out is that what's being the framework that's being analyzed here specifically is a real agent that brings about a real object. And so in a sense, in some way, they sort of both have already happened too. So we're not really analyzing something that's happening like within the moment. But yeah, so then if they both exist at the same time, in a sense, you know, we have to have something that qualifies them as one or the other. And I guess this might relate to what you guys are talking about, that you can sort of characterize the activity as going either way, which just means that, neither of them inherently define what that action is. And that's I think that's also implied by the second part of that verse number 2, which sort of goes over the reverse case. So a real object must have already been brought about by an act of production. But then we require a second activity that qualifies the agent as the agent that produces the object. So in both cases, whether we're trying to think about a relationship between an agent that produces an object or an object that's being produced by an agent, we're sort of duplicating the activities that we need to, account for the relationship. And that doesn't make sense. So I think verse 3, okay, so verse 3 is the second part of analyzing when the object and agent have the same ontological status, which is unreality of the agent and object. So I'll just read verse 3. If an unreal agent brought about an unreal object, the object would be without cause and the agent would be without cause. So the way I understood this is that to say that unreal agents bring about unreal objects is to suggest that objects as effects can exist without agents as their cause, and that agents as causes can exist without objects as their effects. So you're sort of making causality completely superfluous. And from verses 4 to 6, Nāgārjuna basically sort of draws out the implications of this view. So that makes causality superfluous. That basically says that the implications of this is that all productive activity is pointless and completely undermines all kinds of paths, whether they're worldly paths or holy paths to nirvana. So it's absurd to say that an unreal object is caused by an unreal agent. So I think that's sort of simple to understand. Then from 7 to 11, these basically go over the combinations that consider the possibility that object or agent are both real and unreal. And I'm wondering how important these verses are. They're important to exhaust all combinations in our analysis. There's definitely value in that. So no opponent or even our own minds can sneak in a way to find an intrinsic relationship between object and agent. But at the same time, I feel like they're kind of just they're basically refuted if you refute the previous ones, the basic ones, mostly because in a sense, something can't be real and unreal at the same time. These are mutually contradictory states. So just from that, you kind of deal with the rest of the combinations. What do you guys think about the value of these other combinations and analyzing them?
Well, if there's anything about MMK methodology, they certainly attempt to be exhaustive. So it makes sense in the context of this chapter. Even though you're right, it seems like some of these are very obviously false or no, it doesn't seem like any such philosophical school would defend a thesis like unreal object and unreal agent. But yeah, I thought it was useful, especially with Chandrakirti's commentary, that this would be exhaustive because it helped me understand, even the more you could say superfluous attempts at attempting a cohesive having a cohesive picture of agent and object are still useful to understanding the Madhyamaka project, I think, always. So.
Yeah, I guess the mind that wants to grasp onto intrinsic existence, if the most basic ways of combining the relationship don't hold, we can expect that the mind will still try to grasp onto different ways of configuring the relationship, even if the combinations are incoherent. I guess that speaks to the tendency of the mind to want to articulate some kind of ontological reality of what it's trying to grasp onto. So yeah, that's why the Madhyamaka is thoroughly exhaustive, so that you have absolutely no space for any relationship that presupposes the intrinsic relationship of the relata being related. And
I also wanted to add, like, I enjoy this notion of treating all of the options as equally viable and kind of shutting them all down equally. I mean, it might be true that Nāgārjuna is more dismissive of some of the options and requires a lot more explanation to diffuse other options, but at the same time, it feels like a very nice level methodology used to kind of, it treats, at least at face value, all of these options with an equal amount of credence to the truth, I guess. And it's a nice methodology.
That's an interesting point, because it sort of points to a possible kind of, I don't know if we can call it a meta reading of the Madhyamaka Karika, where part of this flattening process is that there's explicitly there's a refutation of all these permutations in their intrinsic existence, but perhaps that also implies that on a conventional level we can rehabilitate all of them, and all of these different combinations of analyzing the relationship between object and agent might serve useful, as long as it's qualified with dependently originated relations rather than like intrinsically existing things. What do you guys think of that? I feel like this sort of reflects how the relationship between emptiness and dependent origination. So the explicit deconstructive analysis also sort of supposes that there's this implicit understanding that all of these different things can be rehabilitated and actually serve useful. And let's see. So then verse 12 basically states the mutual dependence of these two. So I'll read, the agent occurs in dependence on the object, and the object occurs in dependence on the agent. We see no other way to establish them. And actually, I should have not gone so fast, because there's an interesting commentary by Chandrakirti in response to verse 11, where it basically concludes that, concludes our exhaustive analysis, all the different permutations. Chandrakirti sort of imagines an interlocutor who accuses him of being a nihilist, or the Madhyamaka being a nihilist, by saying that, okay, so like there's basically nothing that exists. And the Madhyamaka, through Chandrakirti's voice, will say, no, I'll read this actually. In Chandrakirti's words, here it is said by the opponent, it is believed by you that things do not exist. We reply, so Chandrakirti and Madhyamakas, not at all. But for you who believe that existence have intrinsic nature, the refutation of all existence is possible due to the absence of intrinsic nature with respect to existence. As for us, on the other hand, since all existence are dependently arisen, we do not perceive intrinsic nature. So what is there to be refuted? The worldly delusion being accepted, the establishment of conventionally real entities, which are imagined like the water of a mirage, is through agreement on the basis of merely of dependence of this on that and not in any other way. So I like that little definition of conventions as that which is come to by means of agreement. on the basis of dependence relationships, where this on that. I guess that's sort of the basic formula for dependent origination, where it goes like this. With the arising of this is the arising of that, with the cessation of this is the cessation of that, with the coming of this is the coming of that, and with the going of this is the going of that. So it's like one of the formulas for dependent origination. Oh yeah, so and verse 12 is specifically explicates that. And then the final verse of this chapter, appropriation and the appropriator, should be known thus through the abandonment of object and agent. All remaining existence should be considered in accordance with object and agent. I was actually not quite sure what this was really saying. What do you guys think? Well, the following commentary says, the argument generalizes to all existing things. Appropriation is the activity through which constituents of a causal series come to consider other parts of the same causal series as their own. Its correct analysis is thus paramount importance for Buddhists. So is this saying that appropriation doesn't exist?
One thing that's, I think, very Jan Westerhoff, in the chapter in his book on Madhyamaka on the self, explains like this appropriation idea very like nicely, in that basically the Madhyamaka has to consider that the means by which it appears that there is a substantial self is that of the various things that are conventionally taken to comprise a person, at any given time, one of them is some mental event that as part of its contents is taking the other things to belong to it. That's the sense of appropriation. And I think that what Nāgārjuna might be saying here then is that this action of taking X to be mine, of mind making, is the means by which it seems as though there is a unitary self. But the Abhidharmika could still say there's no unitary self because this act of mind making isn't really like reflective of something real, because those things don't really belong to this other thing. But the Madhyamika goes a step further and says, but the act of mind making itself doesn't even actually occur. Like, the Abhidharmika says appropriation, there is appropriation of the aggregates as a self, mistaken appropriation of the aggregates as a self. And that act of mistaken appropriation is a mistaken action that occurs with some non-self mental event as the agent appropriating the other non-self skandhas as the object of that action. And by refuting agent and object, the Madhyamika says even appropriation isn't like a thing that ultimately happens. Like, yes, appropriation is ultimately, at the level of analysis where we are talking about appropriation happening, it is ultimately mistaken, because those things aren't actually belonging to that thing, which is not actually a self that owns those things. But go a step further, appropriation itself isn't even real, because that requires that there be really existent, even if it's not a self, a nevertheless really existent appropriating dharma and the appropriated skandhas, some appropriating vijnana, right? Like if we take the Sautrantika perspective of like Dharmakirti and Dignaga, they always frame it as like an appropriating vijnana that as part of its contents is taking a group of other dharmas to like be belonging to itself. That activity also is being refuted. And in a way, I think this relates to the very famous Nāgārjuna quote about the limit of samsara being the limit of nirvana, because if the delusion which causes continued rebirth in samsara is I making and mine making, as Chandrakirti says, for example, at the beginning of Madhyama Kavatara. But at the ultimate level of analysis, mine making as an activity is done by nothing and is done to nothing. Then birth in samsara, or the reason for birth in samsara, isn't real. It isn't happening. And what's strange about this is
so the non-happening of samsara implies nirvana.
Right, exactly. But the non-happening of samsara is already true. It's not something that you have to like actualize within samsara,
Right.
because the very fact that samsara's basis is an action involving an agent and object, which is not possible, that is a distinct agent and object, the appropriator and the appropriated, means that samsara has to be a non-happening. But samsara being a non-happening is just nirvana.
Right.
So that's what I think might be the point, because appropriation and the appropriator, they're putting in the and the appropriator here to create so that you have this duality in both parts of the sentence. Appropriation, appropriator. Object, agent, right? So that which is appropriated, the thing doing the appropriating, object, agent. And the second thing is abandoned and shown to be unreal, which kind of makes me indicate that the former thing likewise is being abandoned, taken to be unreal. And if appropriation is taken to be unreal, well, appropriation is the basis of samsara. It is the second noble truth. It's the 5 aggregates of clinging. The 5 aggregates that are clung to are suffering. That's what's said in it says, the second noble truth is that birth comes from craving. This is the first noble truth. Sorry, that the 5 aggregates of clinging are suffering. But the second noble truth is that birth comes from craving, which is very closely related to the aggregates of clinging, the aggregates to which are clung. So there is no samsara. There has never been samsara. There's no...
This really really goes to show how rather than undermining anything, the Madhyamaka really makes wisdom possible. From like a Dzogchen perspective, there's no knowledge of the ground does not depend upon conditions intrinsically, so
Right.
You can just go into it immediately and instantly. Not to say that conditions, accumulating positive conditions that are conducive to it are not useful, but there's no absolute necessity to acquire a certain kinds of minimal set of conditions in order to actually recognize the nature of your own state, which is already liberated.
Yeah. And this reminds me, there's a very famous sutra. It's in the Sri Lankan version of the Udana Varga. I don't know if it's in the northern version that got translated into Tibetan, that's more famous in Tibetan Buddhist circles, for example. But it's in the Sri Lankan version. It's called the Third Discourse about Nirvana. There's a set of 4 discourses about Nirvana. And the third one goes, thus I heard at one time, the Bhagavan was dwelling in Shravasti in Jetha's grove at Anathapindika's monastery. And there, there, I think it says there, the Sugata, there the Bhagavan was educating, encouraging, inspiring the monks with a dharma talk about liberation. And they were paying heed and paying attention and engaging wholeheartedly and lending an ear. And then it says, then, knowing the meaning of this, on this occasion, the Buddha expressed this heartfelt sentiment. There is, monks, an unborn, unproduced, unmade, and unconditioned. If there were no unborn, unproduced, unmade, and unconditioned, then you would find no escape here from the born, produced, made, and conditioned. But since there is an unborn, unproduced, unmade, and unconditioned, an escape is found from the born, produced, made, and conditioned. And there's a substantialist reading of this, which is Sansara is independently real, and it is possible that it could have just been Sansara that is real, and there have been no nirvana. But, in fact, nirvana is real, and these two substantially existent things are real, and thus there can be freedom from samsara. But there's also an anti-substantialist reading of this, a kind of I think at least, a Madhyamika's reading of this, which is that what is meant here by escape from the born, produced, made, and unconditioned is not escape from one substantial state of being to another substantial state of being, but rather the realization that what here is the born, produced, made, and conditioned is actually what the Buddha is saying there really, in brackets, is. There really is mendicants, an unborn, unproduced, unmade, and unconditioned. If there were really no unborn, unproduced, unmade, and unconditioned, you would find no escape here from the born. And this, like what you were mentioning about like knowledge of the ground not depending, knowledge of the ground being accessible at any time because the ground is just the unreality or the non-difference between, you know, between liberation, the state of liberation, and this state right now. I feel like it reminded me of this sutra from the Udana.
But if we also remember the conclusion of the 7th chapter on the conditioned, he does seem to also imply that with the unreality of the conditioned, there also is the unreality of the unconditioned. And I feel like I guess the one way to square that, you know, which obviously does not contradict what anything that you said, is that the unconditioned is not the kind of thing, not similar to the kind of thing that a conditioned thing is. So it doesn't exist intrinsically, but it doesn't not exist either, just in the same way that conditioned things don't not exist. So like, you know, so knowledge of the ground is not, you know, it's not a dualistic form of knowledge. That there's a subject that is in the state of knowing an object that is being known. It's like a sort of non-dual awareness. So you can't really say that there's being this unconditioned thing being cognized. So in that case, the unconditioned does not ultimately exist. Mm-hmm. But I guess you can say, I guess maybe from like this sort of applies to a post-meditative perspective, right? So in a post-meditation situation, in which you are amidst diluted cognition, you can still retrospectively, recall a prior moment in meditative equipoise where there was an instance of knowledge on the ground. So in that sense, you can sort of retrospectively refer to a state of unconditioned awareness. But that's just a means of referring to something that's ultimately unreal, because it's referring to a preceding instant through the conventions of linguistic utterance.
Right.
Cool. So yeah, and so I guess the next chapter, analysis of what is prior, we'll get a more in-depth analysis of this relationship of appropriation. And well, actually, it actually says in the commentary here that Buddha Palita and Vaibhavika actually titled this chapter an analysis of what is to be appropriated and the appropriator. So.
Sorry guys, I have to go, but this has been
problem.
good. I'm gonna watch the rest of the recording. See you all next week.
See ya. Thanks for joining.
Bye.
Yeah.
Okay, so analysis of what is prior. So again, drawing a little bit from the commentary, here prior is the person or pudgala, which is the subject of the sense faculties and sense experience prior to those sense faculties and sense experiences. So it's the idea that there must be something to which the sense faculties and sense experiences apply to. And so in this chapter, we're analyzing the relationship between, or analyzing the relation by which a person comes to appropriate, the word is upadana, the skandhas, or the 5 psychophysical aggregate constituents of experience. And we're analyzing it to sort of refute the idea that the person or subject exists independently of and distinct from what is being appropriated. So the term that Nāgārjuna uses here is Atman, but as the commentaries explain, we shouldn't confuse this with the same term Atman, that is the object of negation of the notion of no self. Because here our primary interlocutor is imagined to actually be representative of a Buddhist school called the Pudgalavadins, the adherents of personalism. So they also agree with the basic Buddhist doctrine that the Atman, the intrinsically existing self, that is ultimately real, does not exist. So their point about this person is a little bit more subtle. For them, it seems like it's a way to account for the process of appropriation in the absence of an intrinsically existing self. So the person is basically that which exists prior to and alongside with the aggregates that are being appropriated by it, by which this person calls it its own. But we will analyze even this person, and we'll find that this person that exists prior to and distinct from, but somehow existing alongside the aggregates, does not ultimately exist either. So the commentary here also points out that here we can draw some meaning from the way that the term Atman is not just a noun, but can also be used as a reflexive pronoun, which is what designates an object of a verb when that verb applies to the same noun that is the subject of that verb. So in the statement, she loves herself, she is both the subject and object of the action or the verb to love. And so herself is the reflexive pronoun that designates this relationship. So in this way, this is the way that the Atman is being referred to, as that which appropriates the skandhas as part of its own, of itself. Cool. So I think that was important to lay out because our opponent here is sophisticated. It's a fellow Buddhist. They also agree that the ultimate self, intrinsically existing ultimate self, does not exist. So, but it's more of a question of this appropriator. So verses 1 through 5 basically tries to establish and also refute the idea that the person exists prior to the aggregates. And so I'll read the first few verses. 1, some opponents say vision, hearing, and the rest of the sense faculties. And I think this refers to the rupa skandha, or the matter, material aggregate, as well as feeling and the rest of the mental constituents. That's the rest of the skandhas. That to which they belong exists prior to them, or before them. 2, how indeed will vision and so on come to belong to a non-existent entity? Hence, before they occur, there exists an established entity. So the opponent is basically saying that vision and so on, these have to happen to someone. So what it happens to is this thing that exists prior to this context. Nāgārjuna's reply is 3, but this entity that is established prior to vision, hearing, etc., and feeling, etc., by means of what is it conceived? So this sort of asks the question, this entity, this person, by what means are we designating it as the person that appropriates if it exists prior to that which is being appropriated? It's kind of incoherent if you think about it. If it exists independently of what's being appropriated, that you can't actually say it is an appropriator. So it begs the question, what's the function of this person in the first place?
Right.
This sort of
'Cause
renders a person superfluous.
Whenever it's independent of these things, it's not an appropriator, it's something else.
Right.
So anything that is an appropriator, you could say like some non-appropriator thing becomes an appropriator at the time when it enters into dependence, like independence upon the thing being appropriated. But then you're talking about two different objects, one that's a
Right.
non-appropriator and one that's an appropriator.
Or you're talking about one object that has simultaneously mutually contradictory aspects, which
Well, not
is also-
simultaneously, but at one time has this aspect and another time has that aspect. But
right. But I'm
but
saying
even
that,
in that
yeah.
case, even in that case, just because of like Nagarjuna's previous analysis of like the arbitrariness of like the core properties versus the peripheral properties, like I talked about with the cube, saying, oh, this is the same object, it's the Pudgala, it's just at this time it's lacking this property of being an appropriator, and now at this time it's gained that property. No, if it's gained that property, why, on what basis are you saying that it's the same object? You have to be saying it because you think there's some core definitive property that makes it continue to be that object, which appropriation is not. But then what is that definitive property?
Right.
Any such thing that you could claim to be that definitive property, you'd have to claim that appropriation, it's a better basis for being the definitive property than appropriation is. But I could just as easily reanalyze the situation as two distinct objects whose core properties are not being an appropriator and being an appropriator. And that's just as acceptable of a thing to say. So if that's true, then there's no, I guess, reason to accept this picture of a thing remaining what it is while changing state into the state of appropriating. And hence the prior, it can't be said to exist independently of the things appropriated and prior to them.
Right. I was just pointing out that if the opponent would want to rehabilitate its position by saying, okay, instead of these two different objects, at one point one is an appropriator and one is a non-appropriator. If they're trying to claim that it's one thing that can have these two mutually contradictory states, that doesn't hold. So I mean, I'm not sure if that's super different from what you're saying actually. Because if it's because then the only way you can save that is by splitting up that unitary contradictory subject into these two different objects. Let's see. Okay, so after going through that kind of refutation, oh wait, no. Before we do that. Okay, verse 4 is interesting. If this is established even without vision, etc., then no doubt they will exist without this as well. So kind of goes back to what I had said momentarily about making the person superfluous. If the person can exist without the faculties and the constituents of experience, then those can also exist without the person. So it sort of begs the question is what's the function of the person then, if those can exist without the person? So now the opponent is trying to squiggle their way out into this. And verse 6, the opponent says, no one whatsoever exists prior to all of vision and the rest taken together. By means of one or another of the faculties of vision and the rest, the underlying person is made manifest at different times. So now the opponent is saying, okay, the person doesn't exist prior to all of the aggregates, but exists by means of prior to one or another of the aggregates or sense faculties in succession at different times. And so we'll see that there are a number of problems that come up with this. Nāgārjuna responds, if the person does not exist prior to all of vision and the rest taken together, how does the person exist prior to each of vision and the rest taken individually? 8. If precisely the one that is the seer is also the hearer and the feeler, then it would exist prior to each individually, which is not possible.
Right. Although,
Yeah.
couldn't the Pudgalavadin at this point accept that there are many Pudgalas?
Right. So yeah.
That
So
seems like it would sneak out of this problem if you said there are just many Pudgalas, each of which is prior to each of which is prior to everything except for one kind of skandha or one kind of dharma. But if you're saying that, then you might as well just be saying that there are dharmas, which is not to say that there's a Pudgala as well, I guess.
I think Nāgārjuna actually deals with that in the following verse, 9. If the seer were itself distinct from the hearer and the feeler, then when there was a seer, there would also be a hearer. There would be a multiplicity of subjects. So if you're saying that one, so there's like two different kinds of arguments happening here between 8 and 9. If you're saying that the person exists prior to one or more of the aggregates or faculties one after another, then you're either saying that.
Oh yes, yeah.
Wait,
Yeah, I didn't understand verse 9, but now I see that is actually exactly what it's using.
right.
Yeah.
So the two problems here is if it existed before, discrete faculties or aggregates, you have the problem of one thing being a hearer at one moment and a feeler at another moment. But that's sort of kind of like an incoherent subject because, a hearer can't be a feeler at the same time if cognition is momentary, because of the reality of impermanence. The faculties can't be all exercised simultaneously, is what the commentary states.
What's interesting? This reminds me of the medieval Yogacara position, which actually seems to be that there is a multiplicity of subjects in a sense, though, just because the starting with Dharmakirti and then carrying on to all of the medieval Yogacharans, medieval Indian Yogacharans, I think East Asian Yogacara is quite different. The notion was that what sentience actually is this subjecthood, basically. But the thing to which they ascribed subjecthood to was individual, momentary cognitions. And they said that each one of those has its own subjecthood.
Right.
And the sensation of there being a persistent subject is a fiction made by denying the multiplicity of subjects here, where there is really or by denying this multiplicity in time, this temporal multiplicity. Though of course, because they also didn't believe in the 3 times, they weren't Sarvastivadin, they technically, I guess, in some sense didn't really believe in actual time either, because I guess the Sautrantika position of momentariness is kind of to say that there is only it's presentism. So they were presentists, and they thought that in the present there is some subjectivity that in this conventional past, which is really just non-existent, cognized various objects, but is characterized by that, and then there's a multiplicity of these. But I don't think it's a problem the way it is for the Pudgalavadins, because the Pudgalavadins are trying to argue that this subjectivity is the appropriator, whereas the Yogacharans are just saying that this subjectivity is just a property of a given moment of vijnana, which is one of the skandhas. So I think they would say they might also be willing to accept, and they probably would because they are also Mahayana Buddhists, that the appropriation is not actually ultimately real and is not prior to the skandhas. but I'm not entirely sure. But it's a little bit reminiscent.
So, with regards to this argument that the faculties can't be exercised simultaneously, I think we can flesh that out a little bit. And I think this idea that experience is sort of cognized momentarily as a sequence of any one of the different factors sort of plays into this, because then you can't have this simultaneous existence of multiple faculties without this this self that sort of underlies all of them. The metaphor here is this idea of a monkey in a house with multiple windows. Each of the windows represents a different sense faculty, and presumably the windows too big. The windows are too far apart from each other for you to actually meaningfully see from them at the same time. So the mind can only go from one window to another, perhaps really, really quickly, but it can't actually see from multiple windows at the same time. So this sort of refers back to this momentary aspect of cognition. And I feel like if the Yogacara doesn't believe in time ultimately, they still have some kind of account of momentariness, right? Momentary,
Right.
impermanent arising and functioning and ceasing of these vijnanas. Yeah, so that sort of undermines this basic understanding of Buddhist phenomenology, that experience is momentary. So you can't have them existing simultaneously. But then verse 9 tries to go into this idea that, okay, there's a multiplicity of subjects simultaneously. It's not one subject that exercises a faculty simultaneously, but different subjects exercising their own faculty in the same moment, in the same subject. That's incoherent, and I think the absurd argument that's drawn out is actually funny here, which is that means you can see a cake, but you can't. The person who sees the cake can't eat and taste the cake, and the person who touches the cake likewise cannot taste the cake or see the cake. So you have this completely really weird, incoherent, kind of darkened subject that can do all of these different things, can relate to objects in all these different tiny ways, but can actually have a coherent experience of a whole object.
And so this just seems to be to say that there is really no such person. Because
right.
What we would want to conceptualize as a person is one who does all those things.
Exactly.
So if you're saying, no, there's nothing that does all those things, but there is tasting and smelling and seeing, even though there's no person who does all of those, then that's just saying the same thing that Buddhists are always saying without really securing your unique idea of the Pudgala. That is funny. You're right. It's pretty funny.
Yeah, because just in basic language, the person who sees the cake is the one who tastes the cake, is the one who feels it going down.
Yeah,
it makes no sense to say that there's all of these simultaneously occupying subjects, each of which perform one of the distinct functions. You have no unitary subject, and in a way, you can say that you have no unitary subject that can actually even perform any of the individual functions.
In a way, the Nāgārjuna uses the fact that the Pudgalavadin still has to maintain Buddhist commitments against them.
Right.
Because if Nāgārjuna were arguing against a Nayayika, they could just be like, yeah, you're right, this doesn't make sense. So instead, I'm going to take the opposite route, which is that what you're saying is true and non-conventional. That it is the same person who tastes and smells and sees the cake, and that's actually real, that
right.
person. But Nāgārjuna doesn't even have to deal with that, because he can use the fact that the Pudgalavadins are still Buddhists and those commitments to kind of trip up the concept that they've taken themselves into because of confusion about the analysis of appropriation and appropriator. But they never would have gotten into that confusion if they simply did not understand appropriator and appropriated as ultimately independent things. Their error, I guess, from the Madhyamika perspective, stems from failing to understand the point of chapter 8.
Now, and speaking of chapter 8, something you said brought me back to something I thought of on chapter 8. In the first part where, verses 4 to 6, how it draws out the implications of the idea that unreal agents can bring about unreal objects and vice versa, which undermines causality and undermines the path to nirvana. Something I sort of noticed, and it's just me trying to understand Madhyamaka methodology, is that so Nāgārjuna happens to be a Buddhist, right? So he definitely has an account of karma, but in order for his deconstructive operation to function, he doesn't actually have to be a Buddhist who believes in karma. All he has to do is show that the opponent who believes in karma, the way that they account for the relationship between agent and object, they undermine their own view of karma. And I think that's basically the part of what really makes the Madhyamaka. Madhyamika is not necessarily, I think, when it's performing the function of this like prasangika analysis, is not necessarily a Buddhist, doesn't have to refer to their own view is all what I'm saying. All it has to refer to is that the opponent, the interlocutor, the hypothetical person you're debating, their own conceptualization of these relationships undermine their own, deeply held views like karma.
So,
yeah, and I think that sort of, and I sort of makes me think a little bit about the difference between Svatantrika Madhyamaka and Prasangika Madhyamaka, whereas the Svatantrika Madhyamaka kind of assumes that the Madhyamika, the one who's doing the refuting, has their own view of emptiness, independent origination. So they use these syllogistic arguments to prove the case that emptiness is established or intrinsic existence is not established, etc. Whereas a prasangika doesn't actually have to use any view of their own. All they're working with is showing how certain views of an interlocutor end up undermining other views that they hold. And that's one way you can sort of show that, taking this or that thing as intrinsically existent sort of undermines the interlocutor's own project. So that's all you really need for the opponent to steadily realize the cognition of emptiness, whether conceptual or non-conceptual. Did you have a point you were going to respond with?
yeah, I'm kind of in disagreement. Like, okay, or I guess maybe I would say it's true that the act of reductio ad absurdum is not a Buddhist action. Like, it's not like that's a Buddhist argumentative strategy.
Right.
But the universal application of reductio ad absurdum to anything has a natural consequence, which is the refutation of existence, non-existence, both and neither. And the refutation of existence, non-existence, both and neither seems like a Buddhist activity, even if individual applications of prasangika are not. Doing universal application of prasangika does seem Buddhist. And it seems Buddhist because its natural endpoint, I guess, which is this fourfold refutation, is not something that anyone other than Buddhists do. Or it's not just that it's not something that anyone other than Buddhists do, it's something whose point is the blowing out of, in the sutra to Vachagotra on fire, the Buddha says, when Vachagotra asks what happens to you after you die, and the Buddha says, the Buddha is not to be reckoned in terms of form. The Buddha is not to be reckoned in terms of feeling. The Tathagata is not to be reckoned in terms of formations. The Tathagata is not to be reckoned in terms of in terms of formations, in terms of consciousness. That by which the Buddha would be reckoned, like by whatever, in virtue of whatever the Buddha would be reckoned in those things, that the Tathagata has cut off. The Tathagata is deep, difficult to fathom. And this like unreckonable, that you can't reckon the Tathagata, this not being able to reckon what is there, not being able to take there and say this is what's there, seems like a Buddhist thing, I guess.
Right. I guess I mean I think a way to reconcile what I said with what you said, actually, and we were not in super disagreement, is that I think once the action of this reductio has occurred, once after the matter of the fact, we can retrospectively evaluate and judge that it accords with the Buddhist view, the Buddhist action, and so we can validly conventionally designate it as a Buddhist activity. But I think in and of itself, in its mode of operation, it's not intrinsically Buddhist because it does not require actually holding any views of your own, whether Buddhist or non-Buddhist.
Because for one thing, it doesn't. It's just a rhetorical strategy. It's not an argument in itself or a position. And further, the argument that it is trying to make can be made via other strategies as well, which means it's not intrinsically attached to any such argument or position. There are madhyamikas, or there are defenders of emptiness who do not use this strategy, and there are those who use this strategy which are not defenders of emptiness. Meaning it doesn't have to be, I guess, that prasangika is it as an activity is Buddhist, I guess. Yes.
Yeah.
I would agree.
And I just feel like that's not, I feel like that's also not a trivial point. I think that distinction should be understood in order to deploy the operation properly, because you don't want to sneak in this, because I think by sneaking in your own view, you might start to perform implicative negations rather than non-implicative negations of the opponent's views, which is, I think, the way that Madhyamaka analysis actually happens. We're not refuting another view only to, imply our own or impose our own. We're just simply showing how the other's views undermines itself. We're sort of just drawing out that self-undermining. The opponent will, perform a variety of mental gymnastics, sort of circuitously think of reasons to continuously establish itself, but that's just an incoherent process by which it's perpetuating its own view. The Madhyamaka basically stops this sort of incoherent activity of maintaining their own view and sort of draws out the natural implications of the person's own view, which is to lead to this understanding of non-inherent existence.
It reminds me. There's a great sutra in the Sutta Nipata. I really like the Sutta Nipata. I think it's one of the most interesting groups of Shravaka sutras, especially because parts of it are paralleled all over the different Nikayas, but it in itself is kind of a very interesting collection that seems to have been formed in an early stage of the Stavira Nikaya compiling, but in other Stavira sects, aside from that is the Mahavihāravasin Theravadin one, these different parts of it just got spread over. They just compile it differently, but it kind of compiles things. And there's one called the smaller discourse on Byuha, quarreling or disputing. And the Buddha says in it, I don't say this is how it is, like the fools who oppose each other. Each of them makes out that their view is the truth, so they treat their opponent as a fool. Indeed, the truth is one, there's not another. About this, the one who knows, that is himself, does not dispute with another, but the Shramanas proclaim their varied truths, and so they speak not in the same way. Indeed, there are not so many varied truths, differing from perception of the ever true in the world, but they work upon their views with logic. Truth, falsehood, so they speak in dualities. They consider themselves experts for the same reason. They despise their opponent as a fool. Calling themselves experts, they despise the other, yet they speak in the very same way. And he says... well, yeah, that's basically the point of it. And I guess like it kind of I don't exactly know where I was going with this, but I guess you see the connection between what you were saying about, like, you know, just showing how the opponent's view kind of collapses in on itself without saying your own thing. The Buddha says, "I do not say this is true," though he does say it. It's the funny thing is he says, "I do not say this is true," but then later he says, "Indeed, there is one truth." So I think what he means there is, I do not say to these other shramanas when they are engaging in their disputation, this is the truth. I do know what the truth is, but I don't bring it up in that situation. I feel like is what I am interpreting this.
Right. I mean, I think it refers to like a different kind of truth than the one that the shramanas are sort of arguing about with each other. It is a truth, but it's not the kind of truth that can be explicable as something that can be proposed and established definitively, which also presupposes that what's being proposed can also be refuted. This is, a truth that's beyond that kind of activity, which is why I think actually that Prasangika is actually superior to Svatantrika as a sort of dialectical technique, because Svatantrika, I think, really is effective, but I think it only is really effective with fellow Buddhists who already sort of have certain key Buddhist beliefs being shared. But whereas I feel like a Prasangika can deal with any view, because all it really needs is another view and showing how it undermines itself. So, like, I wouldn't, but I want to be careful here because I don't want to say that this conversation, this debate on whether or not Prasangika and Svatantrika are, if one is superior to the other, or if you can even divide them like that and oppose one another to each other, is an interesting question. I do feel like there's something superior to Prasangika in the sense that it's more minimalistic. It doesn't need anything more than the opponent's view. And I feel like showing to the opponent how their own view undermines themselves, I think is just more effective than proposing an opposing view, because by proposing an opposing view, you're setting up the opponent to take on a defensive maneuver in which they will actually try to refute your view in favor of their view. And so you're actually reproducing this tendency to cling on to views, whereas I think Prasangika operations will just make the person look upon their own view and sort of try to understand what it is that makes them hold on to it. That was a bit of a digression.
I am not sure that I agree. I don't have a response. I get, like, my intuition is, I feel like my intuition conflicts with this in that I don't necessarily feel that Prasangika is superior to, I think Prasangika is superior to a kind of rigid Svatantrika, but I'm not certain that it is superior to a Svatantrika that proceeds through levels of analysis, where, like, the text that I have in mind, or the set of two books that I have in mind here, are Shantarakshita is often considered a Svatantrika, and I'm not really certain if he would have considered himself such a thing. I think these doxographical categories are clearly, like, later than him. They clearly are late, or they're like high Middle Ages categories, right? Like, we even get the notion of Prasangika. I think the first time we get the notion of Prasangika is in that one 11th century commentator on Chandakirti. His name starts with a J. Can't remember his name. I feel like there isn't really a notion of Prasangika.
Jayananda?
Yes, him. Yeah. And before him, I've never really heard of anyone talking about, like, Chandakirti as a Prasangika versus as opposed to Prasangika. Maybe it does exist.
And but really these classifications solidify in Tibet.
Yeah, exactly. And Jayananda traveled to Tibet and did most of his writing in Tibet itself, as far as I know. So, like, maybe Shantarakshita wouldn't have considered himself this way, but this is how he gets categorized. And in two of his books, one of them, Tattva Sangraha, the compendium of tattvas, of reality, and in the other one, Madhyamaka Lankara, the ornament of the middle way. In the first one, the way the book is structured, he starts off looking at an opponent's position and refuting it from a Sautrantika perspective. He takes a certain perspective, the Sautrantika perspective. And then he proceeds to another thing that an opponent might believe and refutes it again from Sautrantika. But then occasionally he'll dip into refuting it, into like dispensing his own seemingly Sautrantika position and taking a Yogacara position instead and using that to refute it. And then as you go to the end of the book, he just switches entirely into a Yogacara position, having brought you essentially into the Sautrantika position and then refuting that very position which he originally took up from the Yogacara position. And then he does the same thing, but from Yogacara to Madhyamaka in Madhyamaka Lankara. So the two books together slide you up, giving you refuting your view, but giving you a new one, but then refuting that view and giving you a new one until eventually getting to no views at all. And I'm not certain that this strategy is really less effective than Prasangika, even if a rigid Svatantrika that starts at the top view and tries to like establish it and be like, emptiness, that's my view, your view is wrong, I'm going to prove mine. Maybe that's not as effective as sitting quietly and just refuting every view that your opponent brings up until they, you know, end up with nowhere, which is where you want them to be. But kind of pulling them along to this point, but then taking out that foundation from under them, and then giving them a new place to stand, but then taking that out too. I feel like this can actually be maybe even essential to the way the meditator has to relate to philosophy.
Right.
And Kamalashila makes this argument in...
That is how we understand the progression through tenet systems as like an educational process. We go from these lower schools to the higher schools progressively and successively.
Yeah. But even from a purely... Because Tattva Sangraha is clearly not a work intended for meditators or really for Buddhists. Like, it reads like a debate manual. It reads like, here is the thing that this group of people believes, right? Like, he goes like, the Advaita Vedantins, the Nayayikas, the whatever, and he just like says, this is their view, here is my response in a sort of short bullet points. Kamalashila elaborates in the commentary, here's the next view. It seriously does not read like it was intended for yogins to read. It reads like Shantarakshita was at Nalanda and thinking like, you know, this is such a big center of learning. We get all these non-Buddhists here and we have all these debates. We need to like prep out our novices for their debates by just having a booklet of stock arguments that they can read really fast.
It's like an inventory of different instruments that you might pick up depending on who your opponent is.
Exactly, yeah. And it reads like the type of thing that is more suited for like it reads like the type of thing which is more suited for the realm of disputation than for the realm of meditation on these tenets, I guess, and contemplation of them. But nevertheless, the strategy employed in it seems to be the same as the one that Kamalashila discusses in Bhavanakrama, which is his stages of cultivation, as how the meditator relates to philosophy. Sort of using one philosophical system, having established it to eliminate one foundation, and then using another to eliminate that until you eliminate all the foundations.
It almost makes you think that Svatantrika and Prasangika are like reflections of this other dichotomy between gradualism and subitist approaches to awakening. There's the progressive building and then undermining of grounds until you reach awakening, versus this instant direct experience that's made possible through re-recognizing the fault of misrecognition in the present moment. I guess I want to elaborate a little bit on this idea that Prasangika is superior, because I know that is tricky language. That is, it's problematic sometimes in some ways. The way I want to understand this is that I think what I get from certain kinds of Tibetan scholars is that Prasangika and Svatantrika are kind of seen as classes of scholars. And I actually think, so like you're reading into someone and saying, like, oh, Bhavavika is a complete Svatantrika Madhyamika, Chandakirti and Buddhapalita are complete Prasangikas. They are superior, and we are superior because we follow their line. That's kind of like a tribalistic orientation to these things. Whereas I think that Svatantrika and Prasangika say less about the type of adherent, and they're more different techniques. They're these different instruments that we can deploy for our project. So the same person can be a so-called Svatantrika and a Prasangika, because they're not defined by which technique they use, which technique that they use, but they can use both depending on the circumstances at hand. And so you can be both at the same time. And within that case, I feel like because the Svatantrika and the Prasangika techniques are both interested in the same end goal, I just think there's something more direct and immediate to the Prasangika that makes it a superior techniques. But that doesn't mean that because of that, that's the only thing you should use, because different circumstances require different things. So
Right.
that's kind of where I'm trying to understand this relationship between Prasangika being better, but that doesn't mean like give up Svatantrika and become a Prasangika. I feel like that ends up reifying Prasangika as if Prasangika has its own view.
Mhm.
As if you're the adherent of the view of Prasangika, which makes no sense to me.
And these two then could be like, I guess then even to say then that Prasangika is superior, maybe what might be better than saying it's superior is it's more direct.
Sure.
Sure, would you agree with that? Because
Yeah,
like,
I guess.
I just thought, for example, Shantarakshita, again, bringing him up, he follows this thing. But he also, for example, was known, like in his text it's mentioned, to have been an admirer of Shantideva. And Shantideva's 9th chapter is often taken to be very clearly a example of this non-gradualist direct approach to wisdom, where you just cut through all of these. No need to first establish I mean, sometimes it's unclear because some people take his 8th chapter to actually be relying on an Abhidharma viewpoint. But like, that's because like Pranya Karamati, who's the earliest commentator on him, takes his 8th chapter to be from an Abhidharma viewpoint and the 9th chapter from a like Madhyamaka viewpoint. So maybe you could view him as a gradualist, but in Tibet he's often viewed as a Prasangika who he doesn't need to go through any establishing a position and then like doing anything. He just cuts through views. And Shantarakshita's admiration for Shantideva, which I might actually be a little confused. I know I actually can't recall where I read that, so that might not even be true. But in any case, then, even if that's not true, I feel like an admirer of both Shantarakshita and Shantideva. And I feel that, there's something that I learned recently from Anne about Zen, which is that it's not uncommon, it's not universal throughout Zen, but it's not uncommon in Zen to view the gradual and subitist as kind of working together with each other, such that one almost subitistically, if that's a word, or suddenly attains their first vision of the deathless, vision of emptiness, and then subsequently gradually kind of habituates themselves into conditions which lead to the rearising of experiencing that again and again. And so what Anne said is, he used the word kensho, which is used in Japanese Zen for this moment, is he says you might have hundreds, thousands of like experiences of kensho in like the career of a bodhisattva who practices Zen. And each one of those happens suddenly and is an instant insight into the true nature of things, emptiness. But in the interim periods, engaging in gradual cultivation may be what's necessary to set the situation for the arising of another such moment as you gradually habituate yourself into it. So I wonder if these two, it's more the direct and the indirect, And that just as how when something is directly before you, you can go directly to it. But when there are obstacles in the way, you must first take an indirect path to evade them until you get to the point where you're around all the obstacles and it's directly in front of you. Maybe you have to apply both. You have to apply both Svatantrika at some times and Prasangika at other times, or you have to Svatantrika-esque approaches at some times in the career of a bodhisattva's relationship to philosophy, and Prasangika-esque approaches at other times, in accordance with the spatial relation of realization to your present point in space, if we think of the career as a bodhisattva as like a coordinate plane or something.
Yeah. Well, all of this resonates a lot with Dzogchen. I think the three major points by Garab Dorje is that you have to recognize the state, you have to gain confidence in what you're recognizing as a state, and then familiarize yourself with the state. So even Dzogchen goes beyond this dichotomy between gradual and immediate paths because the attainment is always immediate. But it's moment to moment, and you still have to have a gradual process of acclimating yourself to this instantaneous realization, so that eventually it's no longer wavering. So right. I kind of see this as a relationship between Bodhi and Buddha, whereas you can have instances of Bodhi, which is fully awakened realization, but a Buddha is not. The Buddha is almost like, you know how like at a certain point, enough degrees of increase of something seems like it's a difference in kind. So yeah. like temperature is it's the rising of the same kind of heat, but after a certain point, water boils. There's nothing actually ontologically different that's happening, but there seems to be a change in kind. Buddha is similar, I think. Buddha is basically just the gradual cumulative increase of the same degree of Bodhi, but reaching at a certain point where it seems like Buddha is different in kind from any instance of Bodhi. The only difference is that now Bodhi no longer gives way to Abodhi or Avidya. So it's kind of like we can like oscillate between samsara and nirvana a lot. Perhaps really rapidly, even within meditation, you're sort of constantly, unless you're super skillful, you're sort of constantly wavering back and forth between actually being in meditative equipoise and knowledge of your own state and sort of being outside of it. And
the Buddha in one sutra compares enlightenment to the ocean, because he talks about how the ocean sort of gets to a point of insane depth, but it slopes off to that depth gradually. And so what he says is, just as the great ocean slants, slopes, and inclines gradually, not dropping off abruptly, so too in this Dharma and Vinaya, penetration to final knowledge occurs by gradual training, gradual activity, and gradual practice, not abruptly. But obviously, the Buddha has this this total and constant penetration to final knowledge. So it's like, and of course the Buddha also acknowledges these sort of momentary grasping of that penetration, like, for example, the attainment that's discussed as being associated with the first stage of enlightenment, which is called the opening of the Dharma eye, which happens well before Buddhahood, or like the attainment of being a Buddha, someone who's completely attained nirvana, but is still framed as actually realizing in a moment the deathless element, the unborn, unmade, unfabricated, unconditioned.
And you can't say that moment is partial. It's the full thing. Entirely in its totality in that moment.
Yes.
So I think this also resonates with another principle of Dzogchen, which is that the basis, path, and result are all actually the same. I mean, I would say they're non-different. I kind of hesitate to say they're identical, because there's a difference, there's a distinction between them. But yeah, so yeah, cool discussion here. I guess if we want to wrap up this chapter, where are we now? So we were talking about the incoherence of the idea of a multiplicity of subjects, 9. And then verse 10 talks about the elements. So the elements that the skandhas derive their identity from, which are the basic elements of fire, water, air, earth, and I guess consciousness, but here it's only referring to 4. Well, I guess all you need is the 4 elements for the matter skandha. But I think this argument is also simple to understand. It's just by saying that let me read 10. Those elements from which seeing, hearing, and the rest, and the feeling and the rest come into existence, this entity does not exist among them. All you're really doing here is sort of stretching out the causal sequence that you have to account for in order to maintain that the person exists prior to what's being appropriated. It doesn't really change the fundamental relationship that you're trying to account for by just stretching out how many more things you might have to account for in the process. What do you think? Is that how you understood it, or do you understand it differently?
I think I understood it in the same way. It's like, I think kind of relying on the, again, like previous things that have been discussed, where like if something exists in dependence on something else, then because we've established in so many ways that these dependence relations have mutual dependence in truth, that like you can't really say, then this just accidentally like causes the opponent to fall into the case of like one thing being real and the other unreal if you want it to be prior and simultaneous.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And then verse 11, this one is important, and for it to come up at this stage, is to then elaborate that seeing, hearing, and the rest, and feeling and the rest, if that to which these belong does not exist, surely they too do not exist. And this, I think, is an important point to make, to say that we're not saying that an appropriator of the appropriated aggregates does not exist ultimately. So it's a refutation of like a nihilistic or anti-realist kind of approach to the person, as opposed to the Pugdavan's realist approach. So we're not refuting the realist conception of the person who exists prior to and simultaneously with what it appropriates, in favor of a nihilistic reading. What's elaborated in the following verse, number 12, what entity is prior to seeing and the rest, what entity is simultaneous, and what entity comes after, these do not exist. The concepts of existence and non-existence no longer apply there. So that's the reason why we're not saying that the subject does not exist either, because ultimately we're at a state where the concepts of existence or non-existence are not even applicable. As the commentary states, the last sentence, notice the care with which Nāgārjuna states the conclusion of the chapter. The concepts of existence and non-existence no longer apply there. We think that either the subject of vision does not exist or it does not. Does exist or it does not. Nāgārjuna is telling us that neither thought is well formed. And I was thinking a little bit about like Western equivalents of some of these views, and it seems like the refutation of an intrinsically existing subject that exists prior to and simultaneously along with its experience and the constituents of its experience it seems like it can apply equally to a Cartesian subject, but perhaps even a Kantian transcendental subject. Because in both cases, you have this idea of a unitary subject that is what it is prior to anything that it experiences. For Descartes, this is the case because subject and object are intrinsically different substances. There's the mind and the body. So the mind sort of manipulates and appropriates the material world, which is like an extension of its body. But for the Kantian transcendental subject, I think what's called the transcendental unity of apperception is sort of that locus by which this subject, this transcendental subject, is able to produce and relate to its world. So in a sense, it exists outside of it as its transcendental condition. It exists outside phenomena as its transcendental condition. And I feel like these refutations of a Pudgala can probably apply to those versions of self as well. I'm not sure if it's like an open question. And I think the opposing idea that there is no such appropriator of the appropriated, that there is no person, probably the refutation of that probably also applies to someone like, I think the most extreme example right now is someone like Nick Land. Nick Land thinks that there is no real subjective agent of a process of becoming, but that there's just pure becoming, and that the subject is this sort of illusion that can only exist after the fact of becoming, and that it actually gets in the way of this pure process of becoming. And that Nick Land's purpose is to sort of show this, so that, you know, we sort of become one with this dynamic libidinal process of like becoming. But that doesn't make sense, because these libidinal drives, these aspects of experience, they have to belong to a subject. Otherwise, there is no subject. There's nothing to which it can happen. So there's no way to individuate agents at all. You're sort of left with this view of everything being this dynamic flow of processes without any subjects. But that's not how you live the world. It's certainly not how Nick Land lives the world, especially if he's becoming increasingly a racist reactionary. He definitely believes that there are classes of people who exist individually and with lower IQ and stuff like that. So yeah, so we're able to refute these both realist and anti-realist ideas of the subject of its experiences. Just me trying to think about how this relates to modern and contemporary views. Yeah, and we're basically done there. I have one question. Would you say that the cognition of the cognition that recognizes the inability to explicate the existence or non-existence of the reality or unreality of a subject and what's being appropriated, is that cognition that rests in that indeterminate state? Would you say that's the same as this sort of recognition of emptiness, or is that a step to a genuine recognition of emptiness? I mean, perhaps it's still conceptually mediated.
I actually might even say the other way around, that the recognition of emptiness is a step to a mind with no reference point among the four extremes, right? Because if you are recognizing emptiness, that's like recognizing emptiness as an object, then that's not really actually then you're slightly reifying emptiness at that point. But then when even that burns away, it's like what Chandrakirti says, when the tinder of phenomena are all consumed, the fire goes out too. You recognize emptiness, it consumes the phenomena that are empty, you stop taking them as real, then that's consumed too, and then you really have a mind that rests free from the four extremes. So I might even say that it's the other way around, that the last thing to take the step into is the mind free from the four extremes, and emptiness. The mind that recognizes emptiness is before that even. Maybe.
Well, I would agree with that. I guess like maybe I didn't express my question properly. I think I'm thinking about the cognition of a subject who has just gone through being refuted by a Madhyamika. So they're brought to a point where they have recognized the arguments, have accepted the arguments, and are brought to a point in which their previous inclination and impulse to grasp onto existence or non-existence, both or neither, that they recognize that they can't do that. Is that moment a condition for emptiness, or is that part of the realization of emptiness?
I don't think it's part of the realization, just because none of these arguments refute everything, right? Or like, each of them, I guess, targets a particular thing which you might reify. So I feel like what you
even
really
though isn't the recognition of any individual thing that is empty, isn't that emptiness necessarily of the same quality as the emptiness of all things?
It is of the same quality. This is a very famous verse of Aryadeva's, the emptiness of one thing, like one who sees one thing sees everything, because the emptiness of one thing is the emptiness of everything. But I would argue that just from understanding a particular argument, you might see the emptiness which in truth characterizes everything. But you have to not just realize the presence of emptiness in some things, but realize its universal pervasion. Right? You have to, one, see emptiness, and two, understand its universal pervasion.
Right, okay, yeah.
And
you have to understand that implication.
Right. And the universal pervasion isn't by itself something that follows from any one of these arguments. The universal pervasion, rather, is arguably something that doesn't even follow from any arguments, because I think even the Madhyamika would say, it's funny because Jan Westerhoff thinks that a good way to kind of argue for Madhyamika positions in a contemporary way using a certain contemporary problem, or rather there's a certain contemporary problem in metaphysics and logic, which Jan Westerhoff thinks has a definitive Madhyamika answer to it. The question being, is completely universal quantification possible? That is, quantifying over everything. And Jan Westerhoff thinks that the Madhyamika answer is no, you can't. But if that's true, then even the completely universal pervasion of emptiness can't be stated. You can't, because is universal quantification possible is a question about the logical form of true statements, right? So if it's not, then that would mean that in a sense, the truth of emptiness's universal pervasion can't take a logical form, which means it can't be stated, which means it can't be the implication of an argument either.
I see, yeah.
And so
that seems to go beyond the purely dialectical framework and within which this argument is happening. It sort of brings in an extra dialectical, practical element that is actually what brings you to this familiarization with, oh, this is actually truly universal, but not in an explicable way.
Right. So what I think maybe is that, you realize the emptiness of some things enough times and you meditate on that, maybe you'll start to find it plausible that everything is empty. But the realization seems, because it seems to be the kind of thing that can't have a logical form. And I mean, the Buddha frequently says about the unborn that it is outside of the domain of tarka, which means like formal reasoning.
Well, another thing I thought of is what if the experience itself kind of has a bit of this is kind of difficult language now. Maybe the experience itself has its own characteristic that also sort of suggests its universal quality. Maybe
Yeah.
so like after a certain point, you realize like, so you don't actually have to go through everything. At a certain point, you realize the experience
Yes.
itself lends itself to the understanding that, oh, like in order for this to be the case, it must be everywhere.
I agree. But I think that understanding can't be seen as following from
Right.
any of the arguments. Because if it follows from the arguments, then it has to be able to have a logical form that can be an implication of, statements in an argument. And since it can't be that, even if it's true that you, having gone through these arguments, realize the universal pervasion of emptiness, I wouldn't say that the universal pervasion of emptiness corresponds to getting any of these arguments. Because getting any of these arguments gets you to a conclusion that can be put into words, which, is not the...
So I wonder if this makes me think a little bit about this sort of Tibetan idea of this distinction between the categorical and the non-categorical understanding of the ultimate truth. Whereas
this is Mipam. This is the thing that Mipam
right.
talks about, right?
I think Mipam actually draws this. I mean, I think I don't know exactly the history of this concept, this understanding, but it seems like Mipam definitely uses it, but I don't think he develops it. I think it's been this I think Gorampa Sonam Sangye also uses this.
Oh yeah, that might be it. Right. So there's like a continue.
Sorry. So perhaps this idea that like within the particular analysis of whatever is being refuted, this inability to identify or explicate the existence or non-existence of something, that could be a categorical emptiness. That's a qualified emptiness of a particular thing that's being refuted. But that itself is not the final step. But that could be what helps a supporting condition for the non-categorical, direct, non-conceptual experience of dharmata, of the ultimate nature, free of the four extremes. So it's a facilitator, but it's not the thing itself. And perhaps we can say it's a necessary facilitator. Because it's what allows us to break out, kind of like it almost allows us to break out of samsara within samsara, that then allows us to recognize nirvana. There was something else that I wanted to say, but I kind of forgot. Oh yeah, I think this just points to the case how this kind of negative dialectic that the Madhyamaka operates with, it seems like it's an important and essential thing for Buddhists, but obviously it goes without saying it's nothing without a corresponding positive project of accumulating conditions, accumulating merit to actually allow the understanding that's gained from the negative dialectic to pervade one's actual experience, living, waking experience. But we always need this Madhyamika ancillary framework to constantly ensure that within our process of accumulating and performing meritorious conduct, that we don't, in that process, tend towards something to grasp onto. So, any last comments before we end for today? Okay, so for next week, we can read maybe again we can read two chapters, so 10 and 11, an analysis of fire and fuel, and an analysis of the prior and posterior parts of samsara. I'm excited for this fire and fuel chapter. It seems like a pretty repetitive trope in a lot of Buddhist discussions, the relationship between fire and fuel, so that would be cool. And I don't remember too much about the one about samsara, but yeah, we'll read that too. Cool, so next week, 10 and 11, sound good? Cool, well, thanks everyone. This is a very interesting discussion today. I think we went through a lot of tangential topics that are somewhat related to the reading, but those are always fun and good. Cool. Okay. Thanks. And I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.